Welcome to a session on grief counseling. Today we are going to understand what is grief and how counseling has to take place when somebody is in grief. First of all, let's understand what is grief. Grief is a very natural emotional response when someone or something you love is taken away from you. How do you feel when someone very close to you is taken away from you on permanent basis? What are the emotions that you have under such circumstances? It is a very complex experience. The emotions that you have are sadness, anger, helplessness and hopelessness. A combination of all these is found when somebody is grieving. You are sad because someone very close to you is gone. You are angry because somebody is taken away so suddenly. And you feel helpless because you could not stop it. And you feel hopeless because life without the person looks very gloomy. This experience is extremely personal and private. And since there are so many emotions involved in grief, you can expect wide individual variations in expression of grief. And these variations depend on personality, coping style, cultural background, and many other factors which influence the method of grieving. There is no standard method for grieving and there is no time limit for grieving. Depending upon one's personality, depending upon past experience and depending upon various other factors that are caused because of the loss of this person, the method of coping also differs. And the time that you take to come out of this grief also differs. Grief does not change you, it reveals you. This is an excellent saying because it is the grief which makes you come out with your real personality. It is the grief which exposes your personality to outside world. The real you comes out as if somebody is holding a mirror for you. Now, let us understand the myths about grief. We are stuck with a number of myths related to grief. Let us examine them. First, there is an assumption that the pain is gone if you have ignored it. This assumption is as much true as the assumption that the healing is faster if you break your bone. This is a myth. The pain never goes and it is impossible to ignore the pain. And the second grief is one has to be strong to fight the grief and one should not express grief. Grief is a very natural expression that comes out when something or somebody is facing the loss. So, the natural expression cannot be stopped or it should not be camouflaged by putting an exterior of being strong. If you do so, what happens is the real emotions get bottled up and it will explode in a very inappropriate time. Hence, there is no point in holding back the grief. There is no point in putting a very strong face when you are really grieving. One more assumption that goes with grief is if you do not cry when there is grief, it is assumed that you do not grieve. There is no grief. This is a perfect myth because crying is not the only expression for grief. One may be shocked, one may freeze, one may get hysterical, one may not say anything, one may just freeze and may not show any reaction or response. That doesn't mean that one is not grieving. Nevertheless, we should accept that crying gives a lot of relief to grieving, just as the way crying gives a lot of relief when you are under stress. There have been experiments which showed that the tears rolling down your cheeks when you are under distress have different components, different chemicals from the tears that roll down your cheeks when you cut onions. And it was experimentally proved that the sample of tears collected when somebody cuts onion and the sample of tears collected when somebody is really crying, distress crying, the second sample had some protein components which was absent in case of onion cutting tears. This itself reveals that crying definitely gives you a lot of relief and it makes you feel light. However, doesn't mean that the absence of crying is equivalent to absence of grief. It is also, a myth that grief has a definite standard period, a definite standard duration. Some people say it is 3 weeks, some people say it is 1 month, but you cannot have a standard period for grieving. For some, it may take 3 weeks, for some, it may take 1 month, and for some others, it may take more than that. However, if one is continuing to be under grief for more than a month, perhaps this is an indication that some psychological intervention is necessary. I will not say do not weep, for not all tears are an evil. You should weep, not all tears are evil. There is no restriction on weeping, but at the same time, this should not be understood as if no crying is no grief. One goes through certain stages of grief. Let us examine what are the stages one passes through when one is grieving. These stages are very similar to Hans Selye's stages of stress, which is called general adaptation syndrome. In general adaptation syndrome, one passes through 3 stages: the alarm stage, the resistance stage, and the exhaustion stage. During the alarm stage, as per Hans Selye, when one faces stress, there is a freezing period and then one is under shock. And in resistance period, one would resist accepting the fact that the event has occurred. And prolonged exposure to stress will bring one to a stage of exhaustion. And this stage of exhaustion, the physiological responses or the physiological parameters are low, but at the same time, if one continues in this period of exhaustion for more than the stipulated period, there is every possibility of one getting into depression and also facing suicidal ideation. Very similar to these 3 stages of general adaptation syndrome, as pointed out by Hans Selye, we have different stages in grief. The first stage is denial. The minute you come to know that somebody very close to you is no more, there is a denial. You don't want to accept the fact that the person is no more. And then once it sinks in, you enter into what is called the phase of anger. You are angry. You are angry with whom? You don't know. Sometimes you are angry with God, sometimes you are angry with yourself, and sometimes you are angry with the treating doctors, sometimes you are angry with the medical science itself for not protecting or preserving or saving the person who is very close to you. And this anger turned outward, perhaps you will be expressing your anger by being very aggressive with the person, with the target person. And sometimes when the anger turns inward, you will punish yourself for losing the person. And in the third stage, you come to a bargaining. Bargaining with whom? You start bargaining with God. If only you give me back this person, then I will do this, or I will not do this, and this. And this bargaining also may not work because the inevitable has occurred. What next? The next thing is you get into depression. The sense of helplessness, the sense of anger, the sense of hopelessness, the sense of aggression, all these take you to the stage of depression. And you feel depressed that the person is no more. And the fact, the reality sinks in. And then you come to the stage of acceptance. You accept the fact that life has to go ahead without this person who is so significant, who has been a part and parcel of your life so long. And once this acceptance happens, then you gradually and slowly spring back to normalcy. Now, to quote, "It is useless for me to describe to you how terrible roses, jasmine, and even the monsoon felt in the time that followed. If you have ever lost someone very important to you, then you already know how it feels. And if you haven't, you cannot possibly imagine." This quote definitely talks about the extreme private experience of grief to a person. Nothing in the world looks bright, looks promising, and looks welcoming. The brightest and joyful things like flowers, monsoon, climate, nothing will be impressive for you. And a person who has undergone a similar grief can only understand what it feels. And if a person has not gone through it, it is useless to describe. This is the stage that a person grieving will be. And hence, it is very, very important to understand when to counsel, how to counsel, and how to begin counseling. One of the important factors in grief counseling is to understand the timing. That is, the timing when you need to start your counseling. And you may see that, over a period of time, what happens is the emotion of grief gradually slopes down. And the problems that are there because of loss of a person gradually goes up. The problem line moves up while the emotion line slopes down. When one is under the peak of emotions, there is no point starting your counseling at that point of time, because the cognition doesn't function, the motivation is not there, and the person does not have the receptivity to accept, to understand, and to comprehend what you are talking. And hence, counseling during that time would be futile. Counseling should start at a point of intersection when the problem is gradually going up and the emotion has come down to a level where it is no more disrupting the cognition. That is what is called the point of intersection. That is the correct point to start your counseling. And if the person is in peak emotion, the best way to bring him down to this point of intersection is to help the person release all the emotion. It may be anger, it may be sadness, it may be grief, it may be helplessness. Stimulate the person sufficiently so that the person ventilates. Once again, I would like to say that the slope of emotion curve is highly subjective. For one person, the slope may come very faster. For yet another person, the slope may come very late and it may never touch the minimum, like what you see in this figure. For this person, you see that the slope is coming very late, and as a result, the intersection point is also coming quite late. For yet another person, the slope is faster and the person is coming to terms faster. The stages are passed through faster. As a result, the intersecting point is coming faster and you can start your counseling earlier. So, it is very important to understand this timing and time your counseling for a grieving person. Now, counseling is never neutral. Counseling either benefits the person or it harms the person. But there is no counseling which says that, I have given this counseling, either it works or it does not work, but it does not harm. I would like to tell that one wrong word, one wrong non-verbal communication is sufficient to disrupt the whole thing and cause a damage. Just as the way a wrong move or a wrong cut from the surgeon is going to harm an organ permanently, in the same way, one wrong move from a counselor is going to cause enormous damage to the grieving person. Hence, counseling should be taken up by a person who is trained and who is professional. Now, after understanding the timing of counseling, it is very important for us to understand what type of counseling would suit what type of symptoms. Look at the symptoms of the grieving person, then immediately decide your approach in counseling. You may encounter a person undergoing grief who is in shock and disbelief. The person is not able to accept the fact and the loss is too sudden. The person is not prepared to accept it. There is denial, there is resistance. Under such circumstances, the first and foremost step to be taken up by a counselor is to allow a free emotional ventilation. Allow the grieving person to ventilate, stimulate the person, talk to the person, encourage the individual to talk, and once he ventilates, the emotion curve comes down. And you will be helping the emotion curve to come down, and when it comes down, then you are helping the person to understand and look at the whole thing from a different perspective. There may be sadness. The person may undergo terrible sadness and feel that what I have lost is irreparable and life has nothing else for me. I have nothing to look forward in life. While this is a temporary emotional situation, emotional state of the human being, that is not the fact. Life will go on even after the person is lost. So, what is needed to be done to a person who is undergoing extreme sadness is a reorientation. Helping the person look at the whole event or whole situation, whole circumstances from a different perspective. Look at it from a different angle and give a different meaning to what is lost and what has to be done. Not only in terms of past, but also in terms of future. What has to be done now? This is the reality. What is to be done now? What should be the next step? So, this reorientation should come with proper counseling. The third aspect that you may have, which again is very natural because of the close interpersonal relation that we share with each other, is guilt. When you lose somebody, only then, more often than not, we understand the significance, importance of that person. As long as the person is there, we may not understand the importance of this person. So, once the person is no more, this may induce lot of guilt. I should have done when he was still alive. I should not have done this. I should have done this. So, there is a sort of balancing act which happens at a covert level for the surviving human being, for a grieving human being. So, the person will be caught with a sense of guilt for what has been done or what has not been done earlier. The role of a counselor here is to bring to the perception of this person, the opportunities missed and the opportunities ahead, the new opportunities. Yes, I have not done what I should have done when the person was alive. Many people regret that when the person was alive, I never let the person know how much I love him or how much I love her. Fine. That is not repairable now. You can't undo it now. What can be done is what you should do now for the person who is no more, in memory of the person who is no more, to make the person's loss remembered by everyone in a very meaningful way. One of the ways of doing it is convincing this person ridden with guilt about organ donation. Organ donation is a definite way of helping the person come out of the guilt, because the person who is no more, the person who is not physically alive, the physical organs can be useful in making somebody else survive who otherwise would have been dead today. So, if the person is no more, the same person can be alive in 5 or 6 or 8 more individuals who otherwise would have lost life. So, in order to wash away the guilt, organ donation is one of the methods through which you are making the person live even after the person is dead. So, your reorientation or cognitive restructuring should start with this sort of counseling. Sometimes when you go for counseling to the family members of the brain dead person or a person who is no more, there may be anger. Any suggestion that the organs of this brain dead person who is a relative or who is a family member or closely associated with the surviving person, the very suggestion of donating organ may anger the family member. And this anger may be expressed in terms of very sharp words or accusations. One should understand this as an expression of helplessness rather than as anger, and you should not, as a counselor, you should not allow these words of anger to touch your self-esteem. That cannot dent your self-esteem. This would be possible only if you empathize with this person who is coming to terms with the fact that it is inevitable to lose a person who is already brain dead. It is inevitable to accept the fact that the person is not going to survive. So, such angry words may elicit some reaction on your part. However, what is very essential at this point of time is empathizing with the person and restraining your reaction. Allow the person to ventilate. Let the person be angry. Once the person releases all the anger, he or she is ready to listen to what you are saying. Then there may be a fear in the person. What if I donate the organs? There may be religious repercussions. There may be some reactions from the community. There may be reactions from other family members. And I don't know. I am really at a loss. I am ignorant about whether to donate the organs or not. So there may be a number of fears, most of which may be irrational fear. And at this point of time, cognitive restructuring is very important. All the fears that the person expresses must be addressed with due respect. It may be irrational, it may have some religious connotations, but with the information that you have, with the knowledge base that you have, it is very important that all the fears are dissipated so that the person will start thinking afresh and there is some room for understanding your point of view by the survivor. Now, when grief is normal, then counseling can be normal. The approach can be decided. But there is a possibility that grief is complicated too. Without you in my arms, I feel an emptiness in my soul. I find myself searching the crowds for your face. I know it's an impossibility, but I cannot help myself. Look at the irrational method of accepting that you are no more, yet I want to search for you. This is something which reflects the complicated grief of a person. I know that you are no more, and yet I am searching for you in the crowd. I know that you are not there, but yet I am waiting to listen to your voice. This is complicating the grief. Now, there are certain symptoms and signs which will talk about the complicated grief. When the person is intensely longing for the dead person, then that is one signal that grief is getting complicated. And when intrusive thoughts and images of the dead person is disrupting the daily activities, not allowing you to carry on with your day-to-day life, then that is an indication that grief is getting complicated. When the survivor is denying the death of the person and continues to believe that the person is still alive somewhere and one day he is going to come back, then that is enough indication that grief is complicated. Searching for this person in familiar places, or expression of extreme anger and bitterness on people around you, or when the person feels that the purpose of life is lost and the survivor is having suicidal ideation, these are indications that grief is complex and complicated. When you see such signals in the survivor, that is sufficient indication for you to seek professional intervention. Approach a psychologist and see to it that the survivor has some professional intervention so that he comes out of the grief and he knows how to handle the grief and cope with the loss in a better way. Grief counseling is an approach and a method that will equip you with appropriate coping skills to face the grief, to handle the grief, and to stand up on the face of grief. Grief can be a burden, but also it is an anchor. You get used to the weight of grief. Now it holds you in place. So the job of a counselor here is to make this situation of grief as the strength. Convert it into the strength for the person so that the survivor stands on this particular platform, erect, strong, supported by the counselor for some time, and later he or she can stand on his own. The job of the counselor is to actualize the loss, help the survivor express the feelings of anger, guilt, fear, anxiety, and sorrow. Help the person live without the deceased one. That is, help the person with better coping skills, better coping strategies, so that in spite of the loss, the person can survive and carry on with the day-to-day activities in the most efficient and effective way. Aid the emotional withdrawal from the loss. Give time to grief and its expression. Don't hurry a person who is under grief. This is going to set a time limit. But the fact is, grief doesn't have a time limit. You will only help the person to cross the river of grief by equipping the person to ventilate the emotion and go on with the day-to-day activities. It is very important for everybody around the grieving person to assess the normal grief and pathological grief and distinguish between the two. When you see that the grief is normal, the signals are normal, fine, be a support to the person. When you see that the signals are not normal and grief is complicated and it is going into a pathological line, then definitely seek professional intervention. Explore defenses and coping mechanism which is best suited depending upon the individual differences, and in the assess for proper referrals. It is very important that a grieving person gets an intervention through cognitive distraction. There are different methods through which you can help the person to get over the grief, and these methods are to distract the person cognitively. In other words, you will have to make the person concentrate on something else so that the person does not indulge in grieving and does not get deeper and deeper into the grief. One of the methods is to encourage the survivor to write the biography of the deceased. Write about the person. What sort of person was he or she? What did he achieve in life? And how was he relating to all the others? And what is the loss that the world faces without the person? And if you encourage this writing of biography, then all the thoughts about the deceased person will be converted to positive from negative. The second method is drawing or painting. If the survivor is a creative person, help the person to draw different events, different situations and different postures and gestures and profiles of the person. Then if the person every day is coming with one type of emotion, today the person is feeling guilt, tomorrow hopelessness, day after he feels very sad, and the next day he feels very angry. The emotions are complex, complicated and is getting totally mixed up. Encourage the person to write a diary. Let the person have a diary where the unedited version of all the emotions and thoughts about the deceased person are recorded for his own benefit. This is very useful particularly for the survivor who is an introvert and who does not express himself very freely in front of a counselor or any other confidant. Construction of memory books. You can involve a number of people associated with the deceased person and each one can write a page on the deceased person. This is going to talk about the equation that the deceased person had with all the people who mattered a lot for him or her, and this will give a lot of sense of relief for the survivor who is grieving. Creating a photo gallery. If somebody very close to you, a family member, is no more, then collecting all the photographs of the person that are available and creating a photo gallery or photo album is definitely going to help you a lot, because it will take you down the memory lane when you had excellent time with the deceased person, where again it is a cognitive distraction because you are thinking about the positive time that you spent with the person rather than indulging your thoughts in the loss of the person. So, this positive thoughts is going to balm your negative emotions and you will revive and the normalcy is going to be restored faster. Integrating the belongings of the deceased person. The clothes of the deceased person, the important belongings of the deceased person, it could be books, it could be clothes, it could be small belongings. If you integrate them into your daily life, or if you distribute them to all the people who matter a lot or who mattered a lot for the deceased person, this is one way of distracting the survivor cognitively. This is going to give a sense of satisfaction and a feeling that you are distributing the deceased person's memory to all those who matter to him or her, and this is a wonderful way. The best way to get out of the grief is to help others who are in grief. This not only gives a cognitive distraction, but while giving an emotional anchorage or an emotional support to others who are in the same state, is also going to help you to handle your own grief. So, one person who is deceased in the family definitely creates lot of grief to a number of others. When you are in grief, if you are standing as an emotional support to the other family members, automatically you are gaining a lot of strength and you are also giving lot of support to the others. This is a double benefit scheme where you are helping yourselves and also you are helping the others. Now, there are a number of cultural practices, particularly in Indian culture, which takes care of every aspect that is given here as an intervention method as per psychological counseling and intervention. In India, in Indian culture, there is a mourning period for 10 days, 12 days or 13 days. And during this mourning period, enormous social support automatically comes to the grieving family. Lot of interaction happens, lot of discussion about the person who is deceased, and people do come and take care of all these aspects of talking about the person, distributing the belongings of the person and retrieving the photographs of the person, etc. The only thing is you have to organize this in a better way so that it remains permanently and it will create positive memory of the person who is no more. They say time heals all wounds, but that presumes that the source of grief is finite, but the source of grief in fact is infinite. So, the final solace to the grief or the grieving person is, don't grieve. Anything you lose comes round in another form. Once again, when you want to make organ donation the reality, the fact that has to be driven in is you grieve for the lost person, but what you lost in the person comes back in another form as giving life to those who are struggling with their life. Donate this organ and the person who is no more is coming back to you, coming around in the form of few others who are waiting for organ donation. Thank you.